Thank you for the kind introduction and thank you for having me virtually. I had made all the plans to be there in person, but I had to cancel my trip last minute. So thank you for accommodating a virtual presentation. I'm very excited by this workshop because I think it's very timely and considers very important aspects about autonomous cars kind of impact on the society, which are sometimes overlooked in the community. And so with when I saw the workshop kind of topic, I decided to actually talk about a little bit of like an old line of work on our side, which was really initiated when I was a PhD student back in the time. And I really want to focus on essentially thinking about not just controlling a single vehicle in isolation, which we have made a lot of progress on it, but I want to advocate for other terms and other essentially impacts that autonomous cars may have, especially when thinking about integrating them in a large scale around humans. And when I started working on this line of research, this is what autonomous cars looked like back at the time. And even back then, I was thinking that now that there is this new element of autonomy that is being added to our cities, what are essentially the societal scale impacts of these systems that we must be aware of as engineers who are essentially working on these systems, particularly when we start to have roads that are shared by both human-driven cars and autonomous cars? And I was essentially thinking about the societal scale mobility impact of these systems when they coexist on the road. And at the time, I was essentially thinking about how should we think about the interplay between autonomous cars and human-driven cars at a larger scale, not just at a single vehicle level, essentially thinking about how to control one single autonomous car. And I think back in the time, because we didn't have autonomous cars on the road yet, maybe this seemed too futuristic. But I think now, if you're in San Francisco, you just feel like you're surrounded by autonomous cars. And I think this question is still valid and important and is a timely question to ask. And in this talk, I really want to talk about different components of the cities of future, not just autonomous cars. And I want to argue that when thinking about controlling the cities of future, there are these three components that we must think about. Obviously, we have autonomous cars that we need to think about, but there's also human side of the story because humans are essentially strategic decision makers who will adapt to the presence of autonomous cars. Humans are not just going to watch, they're going to react. And then also the infrastructure, which if you think about it, the infrastructure in cities that we have currently today were built for traffic networks with only human-driven cars. And I want to advocate for essentially thinking about or revisiting infrastructure control strategies that we have. So I'm going to try to briefly talk about these three elements of how we can essentially think about controlling and each one of these three elements to influence the operation of traffic in a kind of larger scale. And I want to start by essentially thinking about controlling autonomous cars. And I want to make the case for why we should think about controlling autonomous cars when interacting with humans by essentially showing you what could go wrong if we don't think about controlling autonomous cars, and then talk about some directions that we can essentially fix this. So let me start by essentially talking about what are the differences between autonomous cars and human-driven cars that I'm considering. How are autonomous cars different from human-driven cars in this talk? There are many different ways that you could think about autonomous cars being different than the human-driven car, but I'm going to just focus on a very simple difference, which is the fact that compared to human-driven cars, I'm going to assume that autonomous cars are capable of maintaining a shorter headway with the vehicle in front of them. And that means I can assume that autonomous cars are going to increase road capacities. So what this means is that I am kind of assuming that autonomous cars can maintain platoons of vehicles because of their adaptive cruise control technologies, so they can maintain a shorter headway and they can increase road capacities. And that's the difference that I'm considering for now. I'm going to build on this throughout this talk. And with this kind of difference in mind, I'm going to think about mobility in mixed autonomy networks. And I want to ask this question that if both human-driven cars and autonomous cars act selfishly, how will increasing autonomy affect mobility? Why am I asking this question? When I say both human-driven cars and autonomous cars act selfishly, I mean that we are not controlling autonomous cars in any way. Every autonomous car, similar to a human-driven car, is essentially asking Google Map to route them through the shortest possible route to their destination. And I want to think about what would the impact of that be. Why am I asking this question? Because it is very well known in the transportation community that there is something called Brace's paradox, which essentially says that sometimes in traffic networks of only human-driven cars, constructing new roads or increasing road capacities may increase the overall traffic delay. And there are many instances of this Brace's paradox, all throughout the world, back in the time. And essentially, some of these instances of Brace's paradox are so severe that sometimes cities had to deconstruct a bridge that they had actually spent a lot of money to construct. So, having seen this behavior, Brace's paradox, that increasing road capacities sometimes worsens traffic congestion, we start to think, okay, how do we know that if we have autonomous cars that increase road capacities, traffic congestion is not going to increase, similar to what happens with the Brace's paradox? So in other words, we just talked about how autonomous cars will essentially increase road capacities. And on the other hand, we have Brace's paradox, which says that increase of road capacities may increase traffic delay. So the question that I'm posing here is that how do we know that if we just start using autonomous cars and not think about these consequences, we may not end up with something like Brace's paradox. Since we still do not have that many autonomous cars to essentially answer this question, that many autonomous cars on the road, we started to study this problem theoretically. And we essentially developed some conditions under which it is guaranteed that using autonomous cars is not going to increase congestion. But we show that if those conditions do not hold, in fact, something similar to the Brace's paradox could actually occur and traffic delays may increase. So how did we model this? And I'm going to talk about these conditions, and I want to walk you through some counterexamples, which essentially show that these interactions may have unexpected essentially outcomes. But let me first start to explain the setup that I used for studying this problem, which helps me essentially explain these conditions. So what we considered was essentially a mixed autonomy routing game, where I assume that I have a network, which, or like a graph, which is composed of a set of nodes and links being the roads, nodes being like intersections. And I assume that I have a number of origin-destination pairs, which I denote by W in this case. And for each origin-destination pair, I assume that I have a fixed demand of vehicles, which I denote by R. So for origin-destination W, R of W is the fixed demand. And then I assume that a fraction of this demand is autonomous, which I denote by alpha W. And then I want to route these essentially vehicles on my network. And once routed, for every path in my network, there are two types of flows of vehicles: flow of human-driven cars and flow of autonomous cars. And I denote flow of human-driven cars, anything human-driven by the red color and anything autonomous related by the green color. So how do I model people's selfish behavior in a traffic network? Essentially, like I said, I assume that people route themselves selfishly, meaning that from going from an origin to a destination, among the possible routes for every human or every passenger, really, whether it's in the autonomous car or in the human-driven car, they act selfishly, meaning that every traveler just picks the fastest possible route that is available to them. And with this assumption of selfish route choices, it turns out that the network operates at something called a wardrobe equilibrium or like Nash equilibrium, dependent on what community you come from. And what this means is that at equilibrium, the delay of travel along all the paths that have a non-zero flow of cars for that origin destination pair is the same. And the delay of travel for the routes that essentially have zero flow of cars is larger. Intuitively, what this means is that at equilibrium, no car had any incentive for taking the yellow and pink routes because the delay of travel along them was longer, and all the others were essentially equal. So I have a mixed autonomy routing game, and I'm looking at the wardrobe equilibrium. And I need one more component to essentially be able to characterize the behavior of the mixed autonomy routing game. And that's a notion of how to characterize the delay along each network link. So in the case of having only human-driven cars, there are these well-developed notions of delay functions, which are the delay of travel per unit of flow along a link. One of the well-known functions, it's actually a very simple one, but we started with the simple one. It's called the BPR function, which essentially says that the delay of travel along a link is a polynomial in the flow along that link divided by the capacity. So this lowercase ml is the capacity of link L when all cars are human driven. And this beta L is typically 4, a degree 4. A polynomial of degree 4 is typically the delay function when we have only human-driven cars. But building on this BPR function, I just explained that autonomous cars are going to increase road capacities in the mixed autonomy setting. So we need to think about how to model this lowercase m. And it turns out there are actually many models of modeling capacity in mixed autonomy networks. But we just picked one of the simple models to essentially simplify this analysis. And it turns out that the link delay function for the mixed autonomy setting will be something of this form, where the flow of human-driven cars is divided by ML, which is the capacity when all cars are human-driven, whereas the flow of autonomous cars is divided by uppercase M, where uppercase M is the flow of link L when all cars are autonomous. So imagine that if all cars in a link were autonomous and they were maintaining a headway, half of the headway of human-driven cars with the vehicle in front of them, then uppercase M would be twice lowercase m, technically. So with this simple delay function, I essentially look at the overall delay in the network, which is the sum of delays along all network links, the delay along each network link times the flow of that link, because I said that DL is the delay per unit of flow. So what I'm going to show you is essentially how do I compare JH, which is the flow when all cars are, which is the overall delay when all cars are human driven, and JHA, which is the overall delay when some of the cars are autonomous and some of the cars are human driven. And in particular, I want to emphasize that in comparing these two networks, I'm fixing the number of cars. So I'm just fixing the demand profile. The number of cars in both of these settings are the same. It's only that in the mixed autonomy setting, some of these cars are autonomous and are maintaining these platoons. And I want to essentially derive conditions under which this mixed autonomy overall delay is always going to be less than or equal to the overall delay when all cars are human driven, meaning that the overall delay or congestion is not going to get worse. But then what I'm going to show you is that if these conditions do not hold, increasing the autonomy fraction may in fact increase the overall delay. So that's essentially what I want to talk about. And to go over these conditions, I need to introduce one more parameter. I promise this is a key parameter, and after that, I'm going to show you the results and then the counterexamples. And that condition is that this parameter is something we call degree of capacity asymmetry, which essentially is the following. For every link L, Let lowercase m be the capacity when all cars are human-driven. This is kind of like a known parameter that we already know for traffic networks of today. And let uppercase M be the capacity when all cars are autonomous. So for example, like I said, if autonomous cars are going to maintain a headway half of the headway of human-driven cars, then lower uppercase M is going to be twice lowercase m. So I'm making the assumption that ML, uppercase M, is greater than lowercase m, and I define the degree of capacity asymmetry mu of L to be essentially the ratio between the two, lowercase m divided by uppercase m. And with this kind of assumption that I made, it turns out that essentially this degree of capacity asymmetry is less than or equal to 1 for every link. And it turns out one important factor which determines the behavior of the system is related to whether this degree of capacity asymmetry is homogeneous across the network or not. So I have two kind of conditions: homogeneous degrees of capacity asymmetry, which means that mu L is the same across the network, and heterogeneous is essentially the case where this mu could vary throughout the network. So with this parameter defined, it turns out that we are guaranteed to be okay in the sense of increasing the fraction of autonomous cars is not going to increase overall delay if we have a homogeneous traffic network and if there exists only one single origin destination pair. So I'm not going to go through the technical details of the uniqueness of equilibrium and uniqueness of overall delay. But all I want to say is that as long as your network is homogeneous and you have just one origin destination pair, you're good. But you may notice that these are actually very restrictive conditions, and having just one origin destination pair for a network is not really realistic. And I want to show you some toy examples, simple examples of what could go wrong if you relax each one of these two assumptions. Um, I would actually, in the interest of time, I will skip the heterogeneous case, and I want to talk about what happens when we have multiple origin destination pairs. So in this case, mu is homogeneous, but I have three origin destination pairs. This is a very simple example. Consider the network on the left. There are three origin destination pairs: A to C, A to B, and B to C. The interesting thing here is that to go from A to C, there are two routes, from A to C through link 3 or going through link 1 and 2. Whereas for the other two origin destination pairs, there are only one route. So what I want to show you is what happens if we have only autonomous cars along OD pair AB. So OD pairs AC and BC, they're all human-driven cars, but I only have autonomous cars along OD pair AB. And I want to look at the overall delay as a function of autonomy fraction along OD pair AB at equilibrium. And here is what the overall delay at equilibrium as a function of autonomy fraction along OD pair AB looks like. You can see that it keeps increasing. So as we replace some of the human-driven cars by autonomous cars along OD pair AB, that is essentially, and letting all the others react selfishly to that, this results in the overall delay in the network essentially increasing. And I want you to think about the consequences of this. This is just a very simple toy example. But what this means is that, for example, if OD pair AB is the richest neighborhood in the city who are the first to start using autonomous cars, there may be actually worsening traffic conditions for the overall network. So this is kind of the type of behavior that could happen when you think about letting autonomous cars and human-driven cars essentially select a route selfishly. And you may be wondering, how worse is it gonna get? There are actually ways that we can bound this performance degradation, essentially thinking about how worse is it gonna get in these extreme cases. But the key idea that I want to convey here is that if we are unaware of the societal scale mobility impact of autonomy, in fact, and just blindly start using them and let everyone do whatever decision is the best for them, this may in fact degrade the operation of traffic network. And I think this motivates, this is not to say that we shouldn't embrace having autonomous cars, but rather I want to make the case for essentially all these exciting control problems that we as the community should think about. And I want to start by probably the most trivial one, which is what if we have altruistic autonomous systems? So throughout the talk so far, I assumed that both human-driven cars and autonomous cars are selecting their routes selfishly. But what if at least I can control my autonomous cars altruistically? In other words, I start telling people that, look, if you want to take an autonomous ride, how about you take a route which is like 10 minutes longer than your usual route? Essentially thinking about what if I don't have to route autonomous cars along the shortest possible path? How can we route autonomous cars such that when human-driven cars react selfishly to their decisions or like route choices, the overall performance of the system is improved? So we've been thinking about that. How can we route autonomous cars to reduce the price of anarchy, which is the term used in game theory to essentially measure the inefficiency of equilibria. And the lower the price of anarchy is, the more efficient your network is. So we've been thinking about such altruistic control strategies. And it turns out there are actually ways to design this altruistic routing strategies, which is inspired by Stackelberg routing. And we can show that essentially the inefficiency in the network decreases. However, these altruistic routing strategies that we developed assumes that I can route autonomous cars in whichever way that I want. So for example, 50% of my demand is autonomous cars, and I can route them either through OD pair AB or through OD pair AC. But with that assumption, we can show that altruistic routing of autonomous cars can, in fact, reduce network inefficiency. But I want to make the case that a Stackelberg or altruistic routing of autonomy is not enough. And for example, going back to this example that I just described, here I said I only allow autonomous cars along OD pair AB. Whereas my altruistic routing assumed that I can route the green vehicles along any OD pair that I wanted. So my altruistic routing wouldn't work for this setting. And in fact, because there's only one route from origin A to destination B, there is nothing that I can do with altruistic routing of autonomy in this case. And it's the overall delay of the system is going to increase no matter what I do. So this kind of brings me to the second element that I wanted to talk about, which is humans. That I think one of the interesting things about autonomous cars is that they allow us essentially new means for influencing human choices. And I want to essentially go back to this delay function that we had. Remember that the flow of autonomous cars contributed to the delay of travel along that link through this uppercase M, which is inherently a good thing because autonomous cars are increasing link capacities. But the reason why this resulted in something braces-like was that essentially travelers were selfish. So a natural question to ask is, can we shape travelers' route choices by further control strategies for maximum efficiency? And we essentially looked into this through one of the simplest routing strategies out there called pricing mechanisms, which I'm sure many of you have already experienced when you pay a toll when going along a link. So we started to think about what pricing network links in mixed autonomy traffic networks looks like. So how can we set prices along each link? Prices for human-driven cars tau LH and price for autonomous cars tau LA, such that when all travelers react selfishly to these prices, essentially optimal performance is induced, the best that you can do in your network. And it turns out there's a recipe for assigning prices for travelers in mixed autonomy networks, only if the network is homogeneous. Such that when you set such prices, the overall performance of the system is optimal. And An interesting thing that is the result of this theorem is that if you check out the recipe for prices, it turns out that to induce optimality, you need to differentiate vehicle types when you're collecting tolls and prices. So, for example, the price that autonomous cars are going to pay is going to be different from the price that human-driven cars pay. And interestingly, for homogeneous networks, the price of autonomous cars is mu times the price of human-driven cars. And given that we assume that mu is less than or equal to 1, this means that the price of autonomous cars is going to be less than the price of human-driven cars. And this is going to essentially induce further demand, and it essentially causes this a phenomenon called like induced demand, that if the price for autonomous cars is going to be less, then maybe more people are incentivized to take autonomous ride, and that would increase the demand. So I'm not even considering those factors, but there are all these important follow-up questions that one could ask. But I want to emphasize that this was just probably the simplest case study for thinking about pricing or influencing humans' choices, because you can imagine that you could only price a subset of links in a traffic network, or you need to dynamically set prices. And the interesting thing is that with autonomous cars, you can have prices that are vehicle dependent, dependent on the number of passengers, dependent on time of the day, dependent on congestion. And this analysis doesn't really consider all of them, but there are all these follow-up questions that one can ask. But I want to essentially go back to what I wanted to essentially emphasize, which is the fact that we need to think about influencing human choices and incentivize humans to make efficient choices in mixed autonomy networks, and autonomous cars provide a great opportunity for that. And then finally, I want to go back to infrastructure control. And I think that's the part which is oftentimes overlooked in the community, because we always are thinking about, oh, how to control the autonomous car, how to put all the sensors possible on an autonomous car, and how can we make autonomous car smart enough to essentially improve things. But I want to essentially make the case for how we will have better strategies, or we would be able to do more interesting things in terms of controlling our infrastructure when autonomous cars are on the road. And I want to show you some very simple example of this, which essentially I call it headway limits. So I'm sure you've seen speed limits when you are driving on a freeway, where essentially the maximum speed that vehicles should stick to is kind of regulated. So given that many of this analysis was essentially motivated by how autonomous cars in change road capacities, maybe we can have something like headway limits, where the infrastructure tells the autonomous cars what headway to maintain with the vehicle in front of them. Maybe that could be a new means of controlling traffic, which wasn't possible before having autonomous cars. So we can really think about this from a controls perspective. How can we essentially control the headway on road networks in a dynamic fashion such that the overall performance of the system is improved? So I want to make the case for using headways of autonomous cars as dynamic control inputs that we can control. So for example, consider two links on a traffic network. We don't have anything to do with the headway of human-driven cars, because, of course, the reaction time of humans is going to determine what is the safe distance to maintain with the vehicle in the front. But if you think about the headway of autonomous cars, let's say on road 1, as opposed to headway of autonomous cars on road 2, maybe that is something that we can dynamically control to essentially maximize mobility in the network. So that is kind of like an interesting controls problem to think about, and we've been essentially thinking about it. And the first step to model this, to answer this question, is to know how these dynamic headways are going to affect human choices and the choice dynamics of vehicles. So for this, we needed a dynamic choice model of like how vehicles are essentially changing their choices over time as these headways are adjusted. And for that, we used a very well-known model, which is in the robotics community is like the bounded irrational human choices. And the idea here is that if, for example, the delay of travel along link 1 increases and it's more than the delay of travel along link 2, then in the next time step, less vehicles would be essentially incentivized to take a link 1 compared to link 2. And the question is, how do you adjust these headways such that these flows are adjusted in a way that the overall performance of the system is improved? And it turns out that this is a really hard controls problem, which we couldn't solve explicitly. So what we did was we trained an RL policy to essentially tell us how we should control these capacities dynamically. And it turns out that once we train our RL policy and deploy that, controlling the headway happens to actually improve the performance of the network. So, for example, consider this very simple network, which is the braces network essentially, and also this extension of it. By using the trained RL policy, which is trained to adjust the capacities or the headways of autonomous cars, we can show that we can get up to 12% or 13% improvement in traffic congestion. And by simply just adjusting the headway of autonomous cars. And if you essentially look at the heat map of how flow propagates in these two cases, let's say in this case, when you have no headway control, both links that here in this network, I have one origin destination pair, origin O, destination D. And you can see that by controlling the headway of autonomous cars, we essentially manage to keep one route free of congestion when the other one is congested, whereas with no headway control, essentially these both of the routes or both of the links that depart node O are congested. Same thing about this other network. There is still one origin destination pair from origin O to this destination D. And you can see that by controlling the headway of autonomous cars dynamically, essentially one route is kept free of congestion and traffic has improved as a result. But this is just very recent work of ours and still at the beginning stages of this. And I think that capacity regulation or in general infrastructure control can have a huge part in terms of inducing efficient choices by populations of human-driven cars and autonomous cars. And we need to think about what are the new ways that we can affect traffic networks once we have autonomous cars going beyond signal control or essentially ramped metering or the traditional notions of traffic control that we are used to. And if we think about all these components together and thinking about the interplay between them, that is the time when we can essentially hope that everybody in the cities of future is benefiting from the presence of autonomous cars. And we have developed systems as engineers that are making everybody's life better. And I want to make this example that 100 years ago, when cars were developed, we were so excited by their development and we adapted everything, adapted cities to the cars. And then years later, we ended up with congestion, air pollution, and all these consequences that we hadn't thought about at the beginning. So now that we are kind of at a great time, essentially, that we have the arrival of these new technologies, how can we think about their deployment proactively to not repeat the mistakes that we made when cars were invented and make sure that this time we are aware of the societal scale implications of these systems? So with that, I would like you to thank you all for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah.
Really interesting presentation, and thanks. I was wondering, so you're in the infrastructure control piece, you're essentially now somehow slowing down the autonomous vehicles to make life better for everyone in society. Now, presumably these will be run by companies like Tesla. And what would the incentives be for them? I mean, could you design some mechanism it makes sense for them to actually do this?
You were able to hear the whole question?
Yeah. Thank you for the great question, and that is correct. In my analysis, I was essentially um, not considering that, and that's I think honestly the scary part. That at the end of the day, companies are going to make money out of this, and it's who knows how these are going to affect the society. And I think that's where we need to think about the kind of regulation policies too, to essentially think about a trade-off between the essentially we need to be mindful of the profit that the companies need to make, but also we need to think about how these technologies are going to impact the society. And one of the examples that which I really like is essentially what happened with Uber and these ride-hailing companies, let's say in New York City, where traffic got so bad at certain areas that essentially the city imposed these regulations on essentially ride-hailing companies. But one of the interesting things to one of the interesting questions to ask Samita is essentially what is the interplay between these companies' selfish interests and the society's interest and their impact on the society? So I don't have a good answer for that question, but I think that's the mainly the thing which kind of motivates this line of research from my side, which is we as the academics should think about how to essentially integrate or regulate the systems. Otherwise, because sometimes to improve traffic, like you said, you need to slow down these vehicles, which is the unintuitive thing that the companies may not like. So maybe there could be some incentive kind of mechanisms that we can think about to essentially get around this issue. But right now, I've been treating autonomous cars as something that I can control in whatever way that I want, which is not the reality of it. And it's actually more complicated than that.
Couple other questions.
Right.
So,
Sorry, I can't.
okay.
Don't know if you can hear me, but
Yeah.
I can wait if any other people in the room has any other questions.
I think we had a couple, but I mean, feel free to go ahead.
Okay. Well, a very interesting study, and I guess to be hypothetical, so this probably have to run several iterations because it's not just limited on the four-step travel demand forecasting models. I think in this case, the demand probably increase as well. For example, if you increase the parking, I'm going to send my car home. And so there's more cars, autonomous cars on the street. Just try to, and if you increase the toll, I probably go to non-toll areas. So definitely there are other studies already done about protonings and whether it's connected vehicle or adopted cruise control because you run too close to the together like a train, a running train, then the car can't get out to the do we use HOV lanes or the right? And so with that, we'll have to force us to make some infrastructure changes. I'm trying to come is that, of course, you're looking at the cost ingredients, the trips, but we have to look at step back, look at the whole societal cost and the infrastructure improvement cost. And definitely probably we'll see some policy or controls, whether it's through tax or as you mentioned about toll and other areas. This is a great topic to study.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think you raised an important point. Remember, in this analysis, I was just looking at fixing the number of cars in the two cases and just changing the fraction of cars that are autonomous. But we know that this is actually going beyond that. And I was essentially treating demand. They call it inelastic demand in the game theory community, which is essentially the demand is fixed. Whereas we know that essentially a way to extend this study is to have elastic demand, which means that vehicles or travelers may decide or to take a route or not, or even change what they want to do. And that will result in probably, if you set lower prices for autonomous cars, probably more people are going to take the ride. Maybe if you set prices that are lower for autonomous cars, some of the people who take public transit are now incentivized to take autonomous cars. So I think this problem is actually way more complex. Once you think about, I designed this control strategy. Oftentimes we just assume that humans are just fixed entities, that, okay, things are going to get better. But humans will react to that and they will change their behavior. And that's why it's really important to think about that component as well, which is and another thing that I want to point out, that this study, it just considers two modes of transportation, like human-driven cars and what happened? Human-driven cars and autonomous cars. But think about public transit or other modes of transportation. When you plug them in this traffic model, how is it going to affect things? Is there going to be a demand of passengers that will essentially move from public transit to autonomous cars? So the point is that we need to think about elastic demands too, and how people change their behavior in the larger scheme of things, not just about a single road or a single vehicle.
Cameron, thank you. I can wait for another question, but if other people want to speak first.
Yeah, I had a question about like if you just take the model as it is, and by the same token as you use, you can say if we just keep a larger headway, then we have all less delays. So then if you have a different incentive, to keep a larger headway for these autonomous vehicles, then it would actually be beneficial. But then, considering that the reason why we want to have a small headway is to save on fuel, so to save cost, let's say. So I was wondering what you think about like also introducing these kinds of costs into your analysis.
Yeah. So for sure, that's an important consideration. One thing I want to clarify, that I'm not necessarily saying that we should always increase the headway of autonomous cars.
Yeah.
The thing is that it actually varies, and sometimes we have to make it be a lower one, and then sometimes we have to increase it. But that's a really good point. And so far, everything that I talked about was just about congestion and essentially some metric of mobility. Whereas there are all these other cost or objective functions that you could think about. One is fuel consumption. You could even think about equity and fairness in your transportation network. And in fact, it turns out that, for example, if you think about something like fairness, our transportation networks are actually far from being fair. And then I think introducing autonomous cars may in fact even worsen that. So to some extent, there is some correlation between congestion and fuel consumption, but in a different way. And I think an interesting thing to essentially think about, which we haven't done in this study, is to think about the trade-off between mobility and fuel consumption. What's the right, essentially, control strategy that is going to achieve a trade-off between the two? And I think the interesting thing is that essentially, as long as you have an objective that you care about, you can introduce that in these models and then think about what's the right control strategy. And you can even play with it to be like, let me change the weight on fuel consumption as opposed to congestion or traffic throughput, and see how the resulting control strategy is different. And I think that is kind of one of the interesting things that we could do with these models, and thinking about the control engineers there, which is, if I want this much improvement in sustainability as opposed to this much improvement in congestion, those would require probably different control strategies. So I have a means of designing the right regulation and control strategies for the objective that I have in mind. But that's a great point for essentially extending this study. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
I have a quick, more technical question. Is you learned a reinforcement learning policy to regulate the headway dynamically. Can
Mhm,
you
mhm.
comment on how variable that policy ended up being? Like, is it changing very frequently? Is it changing infrequently? And I could imagine like your 10 to 15% gain of traffic congestion might whittle down to something like 5% if it's forced to only change
Mhm, 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 mhm.
very quickly.
That's a great question, because one of the things that you see with traffic control is that the time steps are pretty longer. It's not like what we are used to in, let's say, controlling a humanoid or um it essentially, you can't people don't change their decisions like every minute. So in this study, we essentially looked at controlling and changing things once in every 5 minutes. And you're right, if you just change the frequency, probably what your control can achieve is gonna change. And you need to think about that at the end of the day. And during the peak hours, or when the traffic demand is just changing rapidly, maybe you can get around with lower frequency control, or sorry, high frequency control strategies, but you probably have to adjust that as your demand is changing, because at the end of the day, the response time in traffic networks is actually pretty slow, and it's not like other robotic systems that we are used to. So in this study, it's 5 minutes, but if you change that, of course, if you increase it, like you said, the impact of your train controller strategy would change.
May I add another point is
Uh,
that
Sure.
I think we may not have time for
oh,
another
okay.
question. Yeah.
I
So,
just
all
want
right,
quickly want to say that you can see that problem now. We don't have to make autonomous, because the adaptive cruise control already following a non-autonomous car already.
Right.
So that
Yeah.
is one you need to think about. You can probably scale your problem down a little bit. Not look at a totally the future society, but looking at now the adaptive cruise control, how impact the traffic.
Right. Yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah.
And again, looking that into the traditional network modeling, like
Yeah.
Cube and others, and see how that impact into. So,
Yeah, exactly. Thank
sorry.
you. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Thanks both. Can we thank the speaker again?
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.